So, good morning, everyone, and good evening, wherever you are. So, let me just have a brief introduction, and then I'll also discuss the flow of our webinar for this morning. So, as you may know, new approaches under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement provide opportunities for economies to link up their emission trading systems. This can help economies in Asia and the Pacific because it makes it easier to trade carbon and also gives companies more ways to reduce their emissions. It also helps cut down on the costs of meeting combined emission targets of linked emission trading systems. So today's webinar is all about learning more about this cross-border carbon market linkages and how they can help the Asia and Pacific region. So today we're lucky to have three esteemed professors joining us as speakers. We'll start with two presentations, each about 25 minutes long. First up is Professor Michael Melling, who will talk about the theories and practices of cross border market linkages and what they mean for Asia. Then we'll hear from Professor Jackson Ewing, who will explore the potential benefits and challenges of these linkages and how Asia can move forward in light of the changing international carbon market trends and policies. After that, Professor Zhang will share his thoughts for about 10 to 15 minutes discussion about the presentations. And if you have any quick questions or you need quick clarification during the talks, feel free to type in your questions in the chat box, or you can ask the speakers directly right after their presentation. We'll devote around 5 minutes for that. But don't worry, we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session after Prof. Junji's discussion. So let me introduce our first presenter as he puts up his slides on screen. So, Michael Melling is the Deputy Director of the MIT Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research and a professor at the University of Strathclyde Law School. So, Michael brings over 2 decades of professional work on climate policy design and implementation, both domestically and internationally. His expertise lies in carbon pricing and its intersection with energy and financial markets as well as international trade policy. So over to you, Michael.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mara. Thanks for hosting me, and it's wonderful to be part of this webinar on a topic that, as Jackson and I were just discussing a moment ago, seems, to have been a very patient topic for many years. This is an issue that has attracted discussion and certainly attracted scholars and researchers, but in practice, it seems to have sort of been languishing and waiting for the right moment. And we were both surmising that it feels to us like many different factors are kind of converging now that could finally make sort of broader linkage across a number of jurisdictions a reality. And so it's very timely, I think, that the Asian Development Bank has thought about, having a project to look at this in greater depth. Also, of course, against the backdrop, as you mentioned, of Article 6 providing a very helpful international architecture within which linkage can occur. So my presentation will focus on sort of some of the conceptual aspects, the background, if you like, the theoretical scaffolding of linkage. I look at some of the definitions, some of the types of linking, but also very importantly to look at the as yet still limited but still relevant experience with linkage, and then thinking a little bit also about what that could mean for emerging and existing carbon markets in the Asia Pacific region. So first, let's have a look at the concept. What do we actually mean with carbon market linkage? About 25 years ago is when the first studies were published that explored this. A former co-author of mine and dear colleague and pioneer on this, Eric Heites, phrased a nice definition, which I think has been sort of retained across, almost generations of work on linking. And it's a very simple, it brings it down to the simplest element, the basic sort of constituent or condition for linkage. So in this definition, carbon markets would be considered linked if a participant in one market, say, an industrial facility with a compliance obligation in an emissions trading system, can use a carbon unit from an emissions trading system, a carbon market that's not his or her own, but from a different emissions trading system or carbon market for compliance purposes. So in other words, say you are in the future Vietnamese emissions trading system, but you are able to comply with obligations in that trading system with units issued under another trading system, say in the Philippines, if indeed Manila proceeds with that at some point. So that's the sort of simplest definition, that you're able to use units that originated in a different carbon market for compliance. Now, um, this can be implemented again at the sort of most basic level with a provision in the legal framework of that carbon market saying units from the other systems and defining which systems maybe in certain conditions and maybe some restrictions are considered equivalent for compliance. So in the example I gave, hypothetical future example, but let's just play with that thought. The Vietnamese regulatory framework for the emissions trading system might at some point contain in an annex a provision that adds that Philippine emissions trading system allowances are considered equivalent to Vietnamese allowances for compliance. And of course, I will provide examples where that is already the case later between California and Quebec, between the EU and Switzerland, to make it a bit more tangible. So far, we've only used hypothetical examples. Now, typically, it goes a little bit beyond that. You will have changes to the regulatory framework. You will have changes to market infrastructure, maybe coupling or linking registries to allow the technical operationalization, if you like, of the link. And usually, and I'll also go into a bit more depth later, you will also have some coordination framework, an agreement, a memorandum of understanding, something in order to facilitate coordination across the link between the linking partners to ensure that the systems are and remain compatible, to even provide for provisions on how parties can withdraw again or terminate the link if circumstances change and so forth. Now, this is the very sort of basic definition. The fact is, conceptually, before I go back to the same slide I just had, I wanted to give a quick sort of excursion to the types of links that one can envision, and indeed that we have to some extent already seen. So the basic definition I provided was if one system allows units from another system to serve equivalent, if you like, to be counted as equivalent for compliance purposes. That would be the first example here on the top left, unilateral linkage. System A, we took the example of Vietnam, allows unit from system B. In that case, I hypothetically proposed Philippines for compliance. Of course, ideally, you will have both jurisdictions or both emissions trading system or carbon market, operators, administrators agree reciprocally so that you have a more robust flow across the link. So both Vietnam and the Philippines would agree that they reciprocally allow for compliance the units from the other system. That would be a bilateral link. And economists are pretty clear that, you do not really leverage the full economic benefits of linkage, which I'll talk about in a moment, unless you have a bilateral linkage. Otherwise, it's a one-way street, and you can only sort of leverage part of those benefits only in one direction, essentially. Now, if you think of bilateral linkage like that, you could, of course, just keep adding further actors, and this further harnesses or realizes the promise of economic benefits from linkage, economic and environmental benefits for that matter, if you add more and more parties. So really, when linking was sort of discussed a lot in Europe, to some extent also North America and some other parts of the world 15 years ago, at a time when it became increasingly clear that we wouldn't have a Kyoto 2 sort of top-down international carbon market, the policy thinking at the time, reflected in a number of policy documents and high-level studies, was that we might go to a global market from a different direction, from the bottom up, by having a North American trading system, a European trading system, an Asian trading system, and over time these would all link in. So you would still have some form of global trading, but not due to a multilateral agreement, rather due to linking, organic linking of national and regional trading systems. So a multilateral link, as you can see in the middle image here, would allow flows between a number of different jurisdictions. There is finally a third way of thinking about linking that we also have to be aware of, and that is indirect linking. So if you have a party A and a party B that have a bilateral link, and then at the same time, party B, the carbon market in party B, becomes linked with a carbon market in jurisdiction C, you may not have a direct link between A and C if they never spoke to each other, or for some reason, don't think that they should be linked. Yet, because flows are now possible between A and B and between B and C, you will have indirect impacts also between A and C. So, for instance, hypothetically, let's assume that buyers in C are really eager to buy a lot of allowances because prices in the carbon market in C, for instance, are very high. They will purchase a number of allowances from system B. You will have a shortage of allowances in system B, driving prices up. So then you might also see that demand for allowances spill over to system A, even though it originated in system C, which is not directly linked to system A. So indirect linkages are something almost one could say an unintended effect potentially that one does have to be aware of when thinking about linking between more than two parties. All right, so that's just a high-level overview of the different types of links. Now, the question, of course, is why? Why would we think about linking, and what could it mean for Asia? And let me just start, and I think, for most of the viewers, for the audience, this is not something that they're not familiar with, probably better than I am, that, of course, Asia is, as a region, one of the hotspots currently of carbon market development, with a number of jurisdictions exploring introduction or advancing introduction of national emissions trading systems, but also carbon crediting systems. And there's also been discussion for a while already of what the potential might be over time to start exploring some sort of integration through linkage, through cooperation between these carbon markets. And Jackson Ewing, who will be speaking after me, has pioneered some of the work on this many years ago already, by thinking about opportunities for linkage in East Asia. Of course, China, with its national emissions trading system that has been operational for a number of years now, even though it for now only covers the power system, is already the world's largest emissions trading system, so the largest compliance carbon market. And it will expand to additional sectors. That's already been announced. And of course, we also know that other large jurisdictions like Indonesia, for instance, are introducing their own carbon markets, their own emissions trading systems. So this is a region that will really be deploying emissions trading or carbon trading as a policy option to advance its decarbonization objectives. And that, of course, gives rise to this thinking or this opportunity to explore ways of cooperating and leveraging benefits. And what is the main benefit that has attracted attention around linking? So the benefit is essentially that as you expand the market size by adding another carbon market through linking, by adding a whole number of additional units, tradable units, or credits or allowances, and market participants, you first of all increase the amount of or the heterogeneity of abatement costs across the system. So, system A and system B will have different market participants with different marginal abatement costs. And the more heterogeneity you have there, the more you can leverage the economic benefits of allowing trading. And then, of course, in sort of a Pareto optimal equilibrium, to use some economic terms, you would really have maximized the cost reducing benefit of allowing those with high abatement cost to comply by buying allowances from those with low abatement cost rather than having to abate at high cost themselves. And so in equilibrium, you would have everybody having the same marginal compliance or abatement cost rather than anybody paying more than necessary. So this is sort of the cost reducing benefit of having a market with heterogeneity of abatement costs, and linking can simply increase that heterogeneity, increase the number of participants with different abatement opportunities. Of course, as you have more actors, as you have more participants in the market, you improve the market's liquidity, which can be beneficial both for the efficiency of the market things like price discovery, etc., but also can be very important to avoid things like market power or manipulation. The more actors that you have in a market, the less likely that you will, for instance, have individual actors in determining or influencing price movements excessively. There has been a number of studies. So the research that sort of prompted interest in linking dates back to the 1990s at looking how, how much can one reduce the cost of of mitigating greenhouse gas emissions by allowing transfers between jurisdictions. That's essentially a different way of saying by allowing them to have a link between them that allows participants in one unit to buy allowances from or units from another jurisdiction. So way back already, calculations suggested that the economic savings could be quite significant. And I'd like to pull up another slide that just summarizes some recent research on this. So not all the way back to 1990, but actually looking at the current policy architecture and framework. A lot of this centers around Article 6 as the Paris Agreement provision that allows jurisdictions, parties to the Paris Agreement to cooperate voluntarily by transferring mitigation activities or mitigation outcomes across jurisdictions. But really, and in principle, this is the same thing as linking, as Mara mentioned in the introduction. Article 6 is also considered a fundamental provision to facilitate emissions accounting across linked emissions trading systems. So if you have linkage of carbon markets, that's one of the prime examples of where Article 6, specifically Article 6, paragraph 2 of the Paris Agreement, would become relevant because you see transfers of mitigation outcomes across national or jurisdictional boundaries. And so looking at how much economic benefit you could leverage by allowing or by having mobilizing, broad uptake of this provision, a number of studies concur that these benefits could amount to roughly, on average, 50% cost savings. So to achieve the same goal set out in NDCs, the same overall mitigation benefits or mitigation outcome in terms of emissions reductions, you would have to essentially only mobilize half the economic investment, etc., half the cost. And of course, as you have these transfers across jurisdictions, and we can assume fairly safely that a lot of these transfers across links, if we have really broad linking globally, for instance, not just regionally, but globally, some of these transfers would, of course, occur from um, wealthy or advanced economies to middle or low income economies in the future to leverage sort of these cost or abatement cost heterogeneities, then you would also see significant north-south climate finance transfers mobilized through a link. So there's both the cost saving to achieve mitigation targets and then also the financial flows that this would mobilize that are seen as benefits. And very importantly, you could just think of it as an economic benefit of reducing the cost of meeting targets. But a lot of this literature also surmises or hypothesizes, if we can achieve our current targets at half the cost, how much would that allow us to increase the ambition of our pledges of our NDCs without changing the economic impact of that? And essentially, the research then suggests you could double the current mitigation um, outcomes, the reductions under existing NDCs without changing the economic cost if you allowed for transfer across links such as those we're discussing in this webinar today. And that's quite significant because we all know that we have a tremendous ambition gap in the international climate regime and, of course, at the national level. So a lot of promise, a lot of benefits that linkage sort of heralds if one can tap into it. And therefore, unsurprisingly, research, academic research, think tank, and even government studies have looked into this for a good 2 decades already. And in the report that we're, I believe, launching also with this webinar that ADB will be issuing, um, there's a review of the literature that shows that this is not an issue that has lacked sort of research output. So literally hundreds of studies have studied or have analyzed and gone into the economic benefits, the institutional, legal, regulatory, etc., implications and barriers, the political barriers, and a number of case studies. And the research, if you look at it over the last 2 decades, you can sort of identify a number of phases. It's actually almost 3 decades at this point. At the very beginning in the 90s, as I mentioned, some early studies just sort of look at the hypothetical benefits of allowing these transfers across jurisdictions. This was even still during the period where the UNFCCC, so the Framework Convention, was being negotiated in the early 90s and then entered into force in 1994. There was a provision there, or sort of an initiative, activities implemented jointly, that started to sort of show what such cross-border cooperation could look like. But it wasn't until the early 2000s that we started seeing more specific, more precise conceptual research, looking at the definitions like the one I mentioned, looking at different approaches to linking, such as the different forms, types of linking, and at the economic potential. And then starting in the mid 2000s to early 2010s, at a period when the expectation of what the international climate cooperation architecture would evolve into, from a top down to more of a bottom up sort of architecture. So, really, from Kyoto via Copenhagen to Paris, there was a lot of excitement on how this could actually be implemented, what pathways we might see, case studies of linking between different jurisdictions. A lot of excitement, in particular at the time. The EU had its emissions trading system. The United States, when President Obama was elected, began thinking about a national, or was seriously considering a national emissions trading system. And so a lot of excitement, for instance, around transatlantic linking, but studies also looked at other jurisdictions. And indeed, I like to sort of remind myself how far ahead policy documents at the time looked. The European Commission, for instance, published two formal communications that sort of explored the options, the potential for a global carbon market in which you'd see transatlantic linking, then linking with Asia, eventually with Latin America, Brazil, and a number of other emerging economies, all in sort of an inchoate, a rising or emerging globally linked carbon market. And of course, also the tools and mechanisms and the institutional implications for linking were explored in much more detail at the time. Then, in a critical phase, as it became increasingly clear that linking was not so easy to advance and that there were a number of barriers, a number of obstacles, the politics was more complex than at the time earlier had been sort of anticipated. Um, there was a new wave of research that was, let's say, a little bit more skeptical of linking. There were some studies that said, maybe we have to look at different ways of cooperating, etc. There was even research on things like the equity implications of linking and so on. And I feel like, and this goes back to my earlier remarks, that, every good idea has to wait for its time, that maybe in the last several years, especially now that we have Article 6 becoming operational since COP26 in Glasgow, and is currently being operationalized. And since we have linkage experience with North America, with Europe, EU, and Switzerland, for instance, that we're also digesting the lessons learned from that there is sort of a new perspective that this may now finally be something that could become more serious going forward with the rapid growth in numbers of emissions trading systems of carbon markets around the world. So thinking about, I've mentioned it repeatedly, the actual experience with linkage, there was many examples of unilateral linking earlier in sort of the mid 2000s and then late 2000s. One example is the Chicago Climate Exchange, which was unilaterally linked to the European Union's emissions trading system before it eventually delinked and then also ceased to exist. This was a voluntary system. But then many domestic emissions trading systems, like the New Zealand ETS, the South Korean ETS, the Swiss ETS, have had unilateral links to project-based mechanisms like the CDM and joint implementation under the Kyoto Protocol. But there were also some early experiences with bilateral linkage. For instance, Norway had a domestic ETS before it became part of the EU ETS that was linked in the first trading period with the EU ETS. And Tokyo and Saitama already in the 2000s had city or subnational trading systems that allowed for trading across a link. But the two sort of bigger examples, more important examples, are California and Quebec, and European Union and Switzerland, and I've already mentioned or referenced them repeatedly. California and Quebec launched their systems in 2013 as part of the Western Climate Initiative, which at one point was hoping to become a much bigger system, but politics changed. And so in the end, it was really only these two that then developed emissions trading systems initially and then linked them in 2014. It's been operational since then. It's been functioning very well with quite robust trading across the link. For a couple of years, a third subnational jurisdiction, the Canadian province of Ontario, became part of that. But politics in Ontario prompted that province to revoke its emissions trading system. So it withdrew from the link, which was also an important and useful experience to see how that exactly works. All these jurisdictions entered into an agreement. It's not an international treaty since there's subnational jurisdictions. They do not have that power to enter binding international agreements. Rather, it's sort of a more informal type of agreement, but they've fully adhered to that, at least California and Quebec have, that set out a number of different elements. It's a really useful case study. So there's joint institutions and processes, such as a consultation committee that periodically considers how the systems are compatible, how they may evolve and change. If there's any changes, that there's mutual consultations about those. Trading activities reviewed, etc. They have a joint registry. They hold joint auctions under the auspices of the Western Climate Initiative's WCI Inc., a private company that supports this process. And there are provisions, for instance, on withdrawal, on monitoring of net trading flows, which incidentally, because as you can see, California and Quebec are in different countries, will also be relevant under Article 6 to account for the net flows between these two countries, United States and Canada, in order to then see how budgets in these two jurisdictions have to be adjusted with corresponding adjustments to deal with the link under Article 6. The EU and Switzerland started talking about linking over a decade ago in 2010, and it's illustrative how long it can take even between two neighboring jurisdictions to arrive at a link. There were a number of issues that held things up, that some of which had nothing to do with the emissions trading systems and the intention to link, but some of which did. For instance, Switzerland initially did not cover aviation, and for the EU, it was absolutely critical that the Swiss ETS also include aviation. Also, and this is perhaps, tells you something, it is implemented through a binding international treaty. There's a mandate in the EU ETS directive that says, it has to be a negotiated binding international treaty for linkage. And those take longer to negotiate and ratify through the national parliaments, which was not necessary between California and Quebec. And there are infrastructure elements such as a connection between the EU transaction log and the Swiss supplementary transaction log that operationalize this link. And that agreement that I just mentioned, so this international treaty, contains similar provisions to the California and Quebec link, joint committee, consultation and notification processes, etc. There is also a process for suspension, for termination, and how to negotiate if either one or both jurisdictions decide to link to yet further trading partners. Now, when it comes to how, in fact, such a link is operationalized, you've already heard some of the steps. And I think even though I mentioned them, I'll just go through them quickly again in systematic fashion. So the first step typically is to have some kind of mandate, political or ideally a legal mandate in the legal framework of the carbon market that allows the executive branch, for instance, to begin negotiating linking arrangements with linking partners. Then the actual linkage itself, first you have to make a decision. Is it unilateral? Will it be bi and multilateral? And if it is multilateral or bilateral, there will need to be some kind of coordination, obviously. And this is something, and you already saw examples, that will be set out, spelled out in some kind of agreement, whether it's a non-binding MOU, a memorandum of understanding, informal agreement like between California and Quebec, or something that's really internationally legally binding, like the international treaty between Switzerland and the European Union. And these arrangements have to set out certain routine processes, procedures, and institutions that allow administering the link, monitoring, surveilling how it works, how it operates, whether it needs to be adjusted and amended over time, how to respond to shocks and changes, and ultimately, of course, things like withdrawal or termination should that become necessary over time. All this has to fit in and be aligned with the legislative and regulatory frameworks of the respective carbon markets. And nowadays, with the Paris Agreement, and I've mentioned it several times, with Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, you also have to make sure that the link will allow for compliance with the provisions of the Paris Agreement when it comes to emissions reporting and accounting, but also things like share of proceeds under Article 6.2, which is not mandatory, but encouraged or recommended, whether linkage should result, for instance, in something like that. My final slide, looking at some of the sort of takeaways from everything that has been researched, has been studied, and has been observed in linkages so far, is that the fact that Asia is seeing so many carbon markets currently under development or just recently having emerged with very different circumstances, socioeconomic circumstances on the ground, is really an opportunity because it allows sort of already thinking now as these systems emerge, how one could leverage the diversity, the heterogeneity of abatement costs, the different levels of development, the different abatement opportunities in different jurisdictions in the Asian and Asia Pacific region through linking. And this is something that ideally will also inform already the thinking about the design of carbon markets, what exactly, including things like a mandate to explore and even cooperate with other jurisdictions on linking. That would facilitate it down the road once these systems are a little bit more mature and ready to actually begin thinking in earnest about linking. Very useful, of course, is the fact that many of these systems are already very well embedded in international processes. Let's just think of things like the Partnership for Market um, um, implementation of the World Bank. Of course, the Asian Development Bank has a number of capacity building and readiness initiatives on carbon markets, the International Carbon Action Partnership, the OECD's inclusive forum and carbon mitigation approaches, and of course, the whole Article 6 process under the UNFCCC. So all of these can help sort of ensure that there is alignment with emerging international standards, rules, and best practices. And as I mentioned already, including this mandate to think about linking and to keep sort of the door open for future carbon market integration can be a very useful first step. But at this point in the development of these very early stage systems in many cases, such as in Vietnam, where I am right now, or Indonesia, etc., it's really also thinking about, building trust, building cooperation by being transparent, by having fora through which to discuss and have conversations with potential future linking partners, and generally sort of thinking about this in good faith and looking at the opportunities, studying the opportunities to build awareness and educate stakeholders on what this opportunity could mean down the road as the systems become more mature. And now I'll stop, Mara. I'm sure you've had an eye on the clock, so I'll stop sharing my slides, but welcome, of course, any questions and the subsequent discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Michael. So at this point, if you have any quick questions for clarifications, you may ask them now. Otherwise, we'll move on to the next presentation. Okay, for I think for the interest of time, it would be better to like move on to the next presentation. So Michael gave a good gave a comprehensive overview of the concept of carbon market linkages with along with case studies. So he also touched upon the different mechanisms and steps on developing market linkages. So the next that's a good introduction for our next presentation, which will basically cover market opportunities, carbon market opportunities in Asia. Our next presenter is Professor Jackson Ewing. So Jackson serves as the Director of Energy and Climate Policy at the Duke University Nicholas Institute of Energy, Environment, and Sustainability. He is also an adjunct associate professor at the Nicholas School of the Environment and a faculty affiliate with the Duke Center for International Development. Jackson's research spans various areas, including international climate finance, just transition partnerships, environmental markets, and U.S. China climate and energy relations. So, over to you, Jackson. You have 25 minutes for your presentation.
Thanks so much, Mara. Thank you, Michael, for getting us off on such an interesting foot. Thank you to everyone at ADB who made this possible and to everyone who has joined us for the session. Michael and I are covering some similar ground here, which isn't surprising given that we've had different collaborations on this topic over the years. And so with that in mind, I will try to not be repetitive and also encourage the audience and the participants to look towards this additional color that I provide on some of the specifics of Asian markets with Michael's broader points in mind about, in particular, the different options for linking, the different continuum of linking possibilities, and the different ways in which that offers particularly attractive possible outcomes. I will begin by speaking a bit more about some of those potential outcomes that are specific to the Asian context. And some of this certainly has been covered more deftly by Michael than I will do here. But if we consider opportunities across environmental, economic, and kind of strategic or international relations perspectives, I think that some unique characteristics of the region come to the fore. First, when we consider things like leakage prevention, that is the movement of high emitting activities from one jurisdiction to another, which has lower or less stringent emissions or pollution curtailments, that really speaks to the level of intra-regional trade that exists in Asia and that is growing. We see at this point intra-Asia trade being at roughly 60% of total trade that the region is responsible for, and that percentage increasing even in the context of increasing overall trade. So that really dovetails importantly with this issue of leakage prevention because we have these really strong commercial ties and movements of physical goods across the region. It really, I think, creates a greater impetus for the kinds of selective harmonization and degrees of coalescence around different kinds of carbon pricing and climate policies that can levelize playing fields in such a way that disincentivizes the movement of high emitting activities from one place to another. We also see outside of just climate goals, conventional pollution abatement dividends being possible in Asia, including in the case of transboundary environmental challenges. So as we have lower cost emissions outcomes and greater ambitions that can drive energy and industrial transitions as a result of greater carbon market connectivity in the region, we would see the co-benefits of less particulate matter pollution at the same time, which would pay dividends both domestically for the countries that are taking advantage of that linkage possibility, but also in certain instances when we consider transboundary air pollution and other regional and kind of insidious environmental challenges that go beyond climate change. Michael really touched on this far better than I would, so I'll be quite quick here. But with the lower costs and the potential for seeing greater climate ambition, I think we have particular importance there regionally as well for a fairly obvious reason, which is that Asia's scale, economically, population-wise, and emissions-wise, gives it an outsized capacity to influence the future of global climate change mitigation. Asia's share of global emissions is now roughly over half the global total. 35% of the emissions from the region come from, or 35% of global emissions come from developing Asian countries. That's doubled since 1990 as a percentage, to say nothing of the aggregate growth when you consider the global trajectory there. So because of the scale at which we're working here, this kind of environmental benefit is really pronounced if we can, in fact, take advantage of it progressively over time. In terms of trade and economy, if we have reduced mitigation costs, then we will enhance that ambition in turn. And I think that we, in this front, really would benefit from seeing strong integration between carbon market tax and pricing policies and national NDCs. And in fact, some degree of communication on NDCs and ambition as part of the discussion that could take place regionally in different pockets in the region around carbon market connectivity and possible linkage in the future. Linkage is not just a technical issue. It's also directly correlated to ambition, as this ultimately is the source of where we yield the credits from. And so I think that the cost ambition nexus is essential for understanding both the potential benefit, but also the process by which carbon market connectivity in the region should be pursued. Michael spoke about more liquidity, which is a function of having more entities, more trading bodies, a greater, broader participant scope for the market itself. This can increase resilience to shocks because of that greater scale and scope. It can reduce the market power of individual players. I don't want to be overly sunny here. Of course, broadening out the market to heterogeneous systems, can also create its own set of resilience and shock risks. But it's important, I think, to see that from the positive light as well. By that growing pool, we can mute some of the effects of one-off economic issues, disruptions from national disasters or emergency events, etc. Particular currency or stock market fluctuations in one place would not scuttle a wider regional market in the same way that it might affect just a singularly unlinked market. And also, this really kind of ties to what I was talking about with levelizing the playing field environmentally when discussing linkage. But we can see, I think, an increased trade benefit as a result of some degree of harmonization on climate policies that affect the embedded cost of carbon in physical goods. So when I say trade here, I don't mean trade of carbon credits. I mean trade of physical goods, which could be enhanced if we do see some leveling of the embedded costs of carbon that exist within those products. There's also an argument for the development of carbon market links being a conduit for confidence building in the region among different players. I chose this photo on the top because my fellow speakers were attending this meeting with me in the mid-2010s when we did a series of dialogues on the potential for carbon market connectivity in Northeast Asia. And as Michael said, trying to kind of build the foundation for that as the markets matured over time. It's also a lovely location in Hong Kong. But these kinds of confidence building measures at epistemic and expert communities into government regulatory communities can pay real dividends. I think it can help to build transparency and trust, and can help to solidify relationships that can transcend just the carbon market and even climate mitigation conversation, and extend to to broader relationships in the region itself. And so it can be pursued with that in mind. And there's also the potential for global reputational gains and diplomatic dividends by using a sophisticated set of climate mitigation tools to address this great challenge of our time, and in doing so demonstrate the kind of governance, economic, and trade acumen of the region, increase that level of ambition that both Michael and I continually have been referring to in ways that further advance Asia's place in the global landscape on climate change response measures. You see that picture on the bottom is a convening of the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition of at that point run by the World Bank, where these kinds of discussions at times are taking place, and is this sort of forum where Asia could play a larger role through some greater regional continuity. Finally, I think that there is a convergence between carbon market developments and broader climate finance that is currently taking place. Whereas carbon markets have traditionally been framed as a way to price externalities and to create more efficient ways to mitigate climate change through lower cost emissions reduction measures that can be economy-wide and can unleash innovation on behalf of the private sector by giving them steadily more stringent goals. And those are the terms I'll largely discuss carbon markets by here today. There is another part of the carbon markets puzzle, which is as a pathway for funding emissions reductions in different jurisdictions that can then offset the emissions of a country or a firm that wishes, for either voluntary or mandatory reasons, to do so. And so while that discussion has largely taken place somewhat separately from broader policy practices and discourses around climate finance, which is capitalizing on $100 billion annual commitments from developed countries to developing, financing different projects for energy transitions and mitigation and adaptation projects, et cetera. These offset approaches via carbon markets are blurring, in my view, these lines more and more. And that's happening through a next generation of innovative crediting instruments. A couple of these worth mentioning are the Energy Transitions Accelerator, fairly recently announced by a combined effort of some Western government and philanthropic organizations to provide some advanced credits to enhance the capital available for coal-fired power station retirements. And I think a strong sign suggests that ETA early actions will be largely in Southeast Asia. When we get to some of the regional markets specifically here in a few moments, I'll speak to some additional innovative crediting instruments that are happening in Southeast Asia on the Singaporean exchange, but that have regional implications. So there really are these energy and industrial transition dividends that can be enhanced through the development of more mature and sophisticated carbon trading practices. And this isn't just the compliance markets and the domestic ETSs that are our main focus here today, but that extend to these voluntary transactions and these offset approaches throughout the region. This figure that you see here is just a analysis of some of the economic opportunities, according to Bain Capital, that exists just in Southeast Asia by 2030. Take that all with a grain of salt, but I use it as just a broad-based illustrative example of this process by which carbon markets and carbon market connectivity can enhance broader development goals. So, excuse me. However, there are pervasive linkage challenges in the region, and they will dovetail, I think, quite cleanly with some of what Michael described about heterogeneous systems, and the potential that exists within those kinds of relationships. I think there is, in many instances, kind of an attendant set of challenges. As we see different systems yielding potentially greater variability and so greater opportunities to find lower mitigation costs, particularly for wealthier, more industrialized countries that have already plucked much of the lower hanging fruit for their own decarbonization domestically, to be able to purchase credits in developing countries where there can be greater efficiency gains potentially and lower cost mitigation outcomes. That also comes with the fact that because those countries and economies are at different levels of development, they will typically have a fairly different emissions trading system designs. And so that lack of system harmonization can problematize the fungibility of credits and the tradability of credits across those different jurisdictions. As I mentioned earlier, ambition matters, not just technical design. So differing baselines, differing system architectures. I'll speak to China specifically in a moment and its approach to efficiency-based targets as an example of an architecture that can make linkage with it more difficult. And then conventional trade considerations that you might find in other commodities, such as those on currencies, potential of having to use some sort of exchange or discount rate to match up the different scenarios that are defined by these different systems across boundaries. And then finally, this would be a relatively complex interaction. As Michael mentioned, even for systems that have relatively similar systems that were designed with potential linkage in mind and have, uncontentious broader relationships like Switzerland and the EU, it has taken a lot of time to develop links. And so that complexity has transactional costs, and it also speaks to political will and prioritization. And here I think that there is a real sequential element. In many of our dialogues over the years on linkage possibilities in Asia, we have heard a common refrain that it's a laudable and attractive potential goal, but that will need time to make domestic systems more robust, and that the linkage possibilities can come afterwards. Famous statement to this effect by then climate special envoy Xi Jinping was, "We need to build the foundation before we start building the upper floors." And so that again speaks to possible time horizons by which this could take hold. And also, I think the importance of seeking out shorter term gains and trust building and incremental linkage possibilities in the interim. I want to spend the balance of my time giving a fairly broad overview of some of the most important regional markets in terms of scale, scope, coverage, and depth of operations and maturity, as well as a handful of more nascent markets. Now, given the complexity and importance of all of these different jurisdictions and ETSs and affiliated carbon pricing instruments, I will do this very, very poor service. And so forgive me for giving kind of an inch deep, mile wide analysis of these regional markets. And I'll try to just stick to a couple of things on each of them that I think are particularly relevant to regional cooperation. China's market, which has both subnational pilot ETSs and a national system that has been trading since 2021, originated in the early 2010s as not only a climate change mitigation tool, but as a flexible set of policy instruments that sought to help China transform its economy from dependence on heavy industry and heavily dependent fossil-driven, largely coal-driven power production, to a cleaner, broad-based economy that is taking advantage of higher value parts of the global economic value chain, including in clean energy sectors. And so all of those drivers can be viewed, I think, in the DNA of the Chinese system that has emerged. And here I just want to mention some core characteristics that are particularly important for understanding that system's relevance regionally. The first is that China uses efficiency-based targets rather than mass-based targets or absolute caps. And what that means is that rather than putting a cap on overall emissions for given covered sectors and then dividing that up among covered entities within it, and having that cap reduce over time, which is how we see the North American and European markets operate. China has targets for the emissions per unit of output. And at this point, this covers the power sector, but will soon extend to 4 additional industrial sectors, and in the future, likely 8 sectors in total. But in any case, it will see these, these output-based approaches, at least for the time being, dominate. And this creates additional complexity for the system. It is also, I think, creates potential difficulties with finding fungible credits that can be traded across boundaries. However, it is also quite attractive for many developing countries, including those in Asia, which will be also seeking to grow emissions over time and thus looking towards potential efficiency-based targets to do so. Moving a bit more quickly, the Republic of Korea has also had a fairly mature history with carbon trading, began to embed climate considerations into larger economic and governance structures in the late 2000s and had the Korean ETS or KETS come into effect in 2015. It covers roughly 2/3 of Korea's emissions and is currently in its 3rd phase. A jurisdictional control over the system has bounced from the Ministry of Environment to the Ministry of Strategy and Finance back to the Ministry of Environment. And the system has consistently become more stringent, including by increasing levels of auctioning, by which covered entities will have to purchase rather than receive for free their allowance allocations, which is also revenue generating, making the benchmarks more stringent that they would have to realize, and ultimately trying to scale up the impact that the market has on Korea's overall climate mitigation approach. However, there's always been difficulty here in matching up supply and demand along various levels. And so you've seen fluctuations of the allowance prices. Here I put a recent one up from mid to late 2023, 10,000 Korean won is roughly $7 for context there. And so having a truly impactful ETS over time will require even greater stringency, which would send a stronger market signal, both domestically and internationally, about the kind of heft of that policy set, and thus by extension, the potential value in linking to it. Japan has a history of subnational compliance markets, primarily here, speaking of Tokyo and Saitama Prefecture, which Michael mentioned as being linked markets previously, but also a long history of private sector experimentation through different voluntary schemes, JVETs, J-Credit, JVER schemes in the past, alongside pervasive national level questions about whether Japan would implement a strong domestic carbon trading policy or a carbon tax, some combination of the two. And there have been various interministerial debates about what the most appropriate pathway forward is, often pitting the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of Economy, technology, and industry against each other. However, I think we have seen really important recent developments in which we saw METI announce the Green Transformation League and beginning a trial period in 2022 and 2023 in which J credits were actually traded on the Tokyo Exchange, has voluntary participation, but mandatory compliance for private sector companies that participate, and will be potentially transitioning into a full compliance-based system in the future. So I think we've never been closer to a compliance market in Japan that could potentially be linked to in the future. Japan also takes a unique international offsetting approach through the joint crediting mechanism, which can develop offset projects, many of which exist in South and Southeast Asian countries, whereby ensuing credits are split between that host country and Japan. I'm over time, so I'll go even more quickly here. For Southeast Asia, I've already referred to Singapore, and it's a very vocal call to become an international trading hub for voluntary carbon market exchanges. It has put things like the Climate Impact X instrument, which is a voluntary offset marketplace, onto the SGX. Has ACX, which is largely trading for Corsia in the aviation sector, the ACI, which is a registry for carbon removal credits. And we have these these potentials for greater convergence, I think, via these instruments of the climate finance and investment worlds and carbon market linkage activities. Thailand, Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia are all at relatively nascent phases of compliance market development. Thailand has the longest experience, really working in various forms since 2013 on an ETS that covers 12 high emitting sectors, but still continues a relatively deliberate development approach. Indonesia and Vietnam are both moving through fairly recently published regulations in phased approaches, whereby we are already seeing intensity-based coverage of the power sector in Indonesia, and Vietnam looking for a trading platform by 2025 and phasing in voluntary or pilot trading and then mandatory trading in between 2026 and 2028. Philippines being at a more preparatory phase, relatively speaking. Similarly, in South Asia, and again, this is a non-comprehensive list, we see India with a perform, achieve, and trade system, which is an efficiency-based system covering over 1,000 entities that is exploring transitioning into a compliance market, and Pakistan developing a committee on the establishment of carbon markets to take that potential policy set forward. Finally, and this is my last slide, I have some thoughts on the potential near-term and longer-term steps for practitioners in Asia to make linkage possible. And this again dovetails with some of Michael's thoughts. First, I think deepening the community of experts and practitioners across Asian jurisdictions is vital, as well as bringing in those who have been instrumental in developing systems outside of the region. I think that this session here is a good example of that sort of activity. Cultivating transparency and harmonization where it's possible, such as on MRV, as a first early step to creating systems that would have more linkage potential. Linking by degrees in the ways that Michael has already described. Using efficiency-based caps as a bridge, not a destination. Having these ultimately evolve into full cap and trade systems would be important. pilot selective market links at either sector and industry level or subnationally, enhance carbon market cooperation within regional priorities. So move this up the list of ASEAN environmental ministerials, up the trilateral summit in Northeast Asia, and get this into the realm of high politics, and work towards regional linkage benefits that attend the Paris Agreement Article 6, which I think Michael covered in substantial length. So I won't say anything more about that. Thank you again for the forum. I'm easy to find if you would like to speak about this more. Back to you, Mara.
Okay, thank you very much, Jackson, for that insightful presentation. So let's now hear from our discussant. Junji Shang is a professor of environmental economics in the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke University and serves as the director of the Initiative for Sustainable Investment at Duke Cushion University. Over to you, Professor Junji. You have around 10 minutes for your insight and comments on the two presentations.
Thank you, Mara, and also thank you, Michael and Jackson, for wonderful presentations. Michael provided a very comprehensive overview of the framework for carbon market linkage, and Jackson provided very detailed discussion about the prospects, strategies, and challenges of linking carbon markets in the Asian region. So therefore, I really enjoyed your reports and your presentations. I would like, in my following comments, I would like to echo many points you have made. The first point is the why we should link the carbon markets, and the motivation has changed dramatically in the past 20 years. Originally, our main purpose is to assist with the emission reduction with a lower cost. But soon, with the experiment of CDM, we found that massive cross-border carbon and financial flows could be both economically and politically challenging. So nowadays, I can imagine that for China to buy lots of the carbon credits overseas or send many carbon credits to other countries, both ways appears to me that's very challenging. So why we still need to do that? I think that Jackson has emphasized multiple times to level playing field. This is extremely important for environmental integrity and also for economic integrity. So therefore, all these countries are concerned with the economic competitiveness if they are subject to different stringency of carbon regulations, and also to prevent carbon leakage as much as possible. So therefore, this is I strongly agree with both speakers. The leveling playing field should become the main purpose. So therefore, this will affect our following discussion, how to design the linkage. And if these countries, they don't voluntarily to link their markets, and they are forced to do that. One is by the new trade rules, right? The like CBAM, and more important, the supply chain requirements. And they have raised very detailed requirements about the carbon emission reductions. In the past 2 years, I have been working with many firms. They are in the international supply chain. Now they are facing the huge pressures, mainly from the European clients, to ask them to reduce. So therefore, the Chinese government in this situation has incentive to increase the stringency of carbon regulation in order to address the needs from the supply chain. So the second is how to link those carbon markets. Michael is definitely a pioneer in this area. He has proposed many suggestions. So and combining Michael and Jackson's suggestions, I think that based on my understanding of the carbon market in the Asian region, maybe we can implement that step in step. So in the short term, these countries in Asia, mainly there are 5 countries. They have more established carbon markets: China, Japan, Korea, and in Asia Pacific. Then New Zealand and Kazakhstan, and 5 countries, they have quite mature carbon markets. So in the short run, I think that these countries, they need to address the domestic problem first. So if their domestic carbon markets are fragmented, and it will be extremely challenging for them to link with other carbon markets. For example, for Japan, right, there's no national ETS, and in China, they're national and still regional pilots, and there's no mechanism for China to link the national and the regional pilots. So therefore, this is should be the first step. I would say the short term, or to a prep stage, and for these countries to at least you need to integrate the domestic carbon market to deal with the domestic market fragmentation problem. This will be the big priority. And in the medium term, I mean, following Michael's suggestion, I think in the medium term is a realistic suggestion, maybe indirect linkage, especially through voluntary mechanism. So there are several the voluntary mechanism sooner or later they will be indirectly linkage. Actually, now it's indirectly linked because for those voluntary carbon markets, and China and many other Asian countries, they have already participated, although to a very limited degree, but the practice, they are a part of that. In the future, I expect that, for example, some sectoral mechanism like a cost share. Yesterday, I was in a meeting discussing with the maritime carbon emission reduction. So sectoral wise, especially those sectors, they are exposed to international regulation. So through those sectoral mechanisms, I think this is will be feasible for those Asian countries to link their carbon markets indirectly. Well, of course, this is the medium-term solution. In the long term, I think yes, definitely we should consider, right, from restricted linkage to a full linkage. This is to create a regionally and globally coordinated carbon market. This is very important to go back to our original incentive carbon market. That's to level playing field. Without a coordinated carbon markets, it's very difficult. Challenges both speakers have identified many challenges. That indeed many challenges. One major challenge I want to. This is also the big fight debate between China and the United States. It's actually the major countries now. It's about the attitude toward ETS, right? So is ETS still the principal policy instrument to fight against climate change? Interesting for the United States and China, the answer may be no, right? There are still many other policy instruments like command and control. In particularly more controversial is the subsidies, massive subsidies in both the United States and China, especially China industrial policies. They have an implicit carbon price. Of course, the EU does not recognize that. So therefore, the carbon linkage in the era of major industrial policies and the subsidies, and how to link the market, because again, our purpose to level the playing field. So this will be a major challenge to address the market. The second, I think this challenge is more technical. Both speakers have identified those technical challenges. These technical challenges, to my mind, there are two issues very tricky. The first one is double counting issue. Since the CDM era, we haven't resolved this issue. So for double counting, even within the domestic carbon market, there will be double counting because for China's national carbon market will include indirect emissions, a very strange design. So for whatever reason, so if in the case of indirect emissions, the double counting domestically and internationally will be a big issue. The second is that I see a trend of rising market stabilization mechanism. The market stabilization mechanism, well, if this is a standalone carbon market, it only affect your own country. But if the markets they are linked, then there will be a spillover of the market stabilization. For example, in China's market in the phase 2 has dramatically increased the tools for market stabilization, with the concern that the carbon price could negatively impact competitiveness. Again, the competitiveness comes to the center of our debate. So therefore, these issues used to be the domestic issue in the linked carbon market, they become an international or regional issue. So therefore, these challenges, they still had, but I think it's worth doing, at least by the intention to link carbon markets. At least we can compare our standards, our rules, and eventually will make our carbon regulation globally more coordinated. I will stop there and look forward to further discussion.
Yes, thank you, Professor Junji. So, at this point, before I ask Jackson and Michael to respond to the comments, if there are any questions, please do click the raise hand button, or you may also type in your questions in the chat box. So, yeah. So while we're waiting for the questions, let's ask Jackson and Michael to comment on Professor Junji's insights. So, Michael, would you like to start?
Of course, with pleasure. So I've been taking notes. Very, very insightful comments, I find, Professor Zhang. And I can't say that I disagree with anything. I think it's a bit of a glass half full versus glass half empty. So um, I've been working, as you kind of hinted at, for quite a while on linking, and it's become habitual to be realistic and slightly skeptical for many years. And seeing the accelerated momentum for carbon pricing after thinking that maybe that whole battle was lost, sort of what economists had been recommending. And, I mean, really the textbook suggests is the approach we should embrace, just never got political traction until things dramatically changed in just a handful of years, in the last couple of years, really. And you mentioned, that indeed the rise of trade-related climate measures, and in particular the CBAM, although I fully acknowledge, and you rightly point out, that this is a broader trend. There's a number of legislative and regulatory measures on supply chain sustainability, due diligence, public procurement with trade elements, etc. But it was really, I think, the specific provision in the CBAM with its Article 9 that recognizes or accounts for carbon pricing in other jurisdictions that has changed the debate and has changed the political economy within governments of especially emerging or middle income economies that have been considering carbon pricing for a long time under PMR and other initiatives, but now sort of got that support also from the ministries of economics or commerce or trade, etc., that has made me more hopeful. But I think you raise a very important point that we are at the same time seeing this turn, this really, really dramatic turn to industrial policy and a very different approach to decarbonization. One that I think many of us, including perhaps yourself, see with concern. As effective as it can be in the short term, it does raise a number of medium and long-term challenges, not least of which is fiscal sustainability in an era of, rising interest rates and public debt and persistent budget deficits, where it's really hard to imagine. I mean, we can't sustain market pull and demand for low carbon products, etc., with continued subsidization. So you have to imagine that carbon pricing at some point becomes the tool that can bridge or address several of the challenges of what the current trend on climate policy, namely industrial policy, is opening us, making us vulnerable to. So in all that, I would just say one thing. I agree with you. The challenges are manifold. The motivations evolve. The technical and political challenges will not be trivial. But the speed at which we have seen the turn to industrial policy, for instance, the speed at which we have seen the EU oppose border carbon adjustments to now embracing it because of an evolving broader geopolitical, also global economic order, suggests that things are possible when the factors converge. When the right enabling context emerges. And so I remain somewhat hopeful that a number of these factors, including the trade-related climate measures, the discussion about some sort of WTO, IMF, World Bank advanced pricing framework in which different countries price carbon, but in line with domestic circumstances, in line with or reflecting their levels of economic development, etc., may all accelerate at some point a discussion about, well, if we're doing it anyway, let's talk about integration. But that does not diminish the challenges you raise. And so we have our work cut out for ourselves if we continue supporting the principled idea, at least, of carbon market integration.
Yes,
Yeah,
Jackson.
thanks, Mara. Thanks, Junji. Like Michael, I agree with all your comments, and I think we're singing from the same book here to a large extent. I'm just going to latch on to this issue of border adjustments, trade of physical products, competitiveness, kind of the global economic landscape, as both a conduit for potential carbon market integration, but also, and maybe we'll just emphasize here, one of the most concerning variables there to my mind, and that's the complexity of implementation. When you hear the EU officials describe CBAM, for example, it's very cogent and logical, and it makes a great deal of sense. It's just an argument that we want to ensure that our domestic industries are not unduly penalized by facing a stringent domestic or continent-wide carbon price that that are not faced by their competitors in their industry, and thus faced with cheaper imports into the continent. Thus, we will try to levelize those costs on that import for covered products to make that a fair equation for our domestic industry. And by extension, we will be putting out a call into the world for other countries to implement more ambitious carbon pricing measures so that they can serve the European market without experiencing that tariff. And that makes a great deal of sense. I think it makes it makes sense economically, geopolitically, geoeconomically, strategically, morally, ethically. It all resonates. And then if you are still around and you watch the follow-up presentation by people from the European Commission who are tasked with implementing that policy, you'll sit through an hour and a half of very complex accounting measures for how you are going to kind of plus up and equalize a ton of steel from location A that has a carbon pricing instrument or lack of carbon pricing instrument, and how that is going to compare to the EU. And it's enormously complex, and there's going to be huge transactional costs when it actually takes place. And it's going to require, and this is not a criticism, it's just a reality, a great deal of proxy level pricing that is not clear or straightforward at the kind of facility level. Or at least doesn't speak to the particular realities of the facility level. And that's okay. That's the best that we can do. But still, when we start to extend those policies to broader trade relationships across more and more products and across wider jurisdictions, the US, despite not having a carbon price domestically at a national level at least, is seeing new bills introduced that are for carbon border measures for importing into the US market. And those measures create a proxy carbon price for our products based on our regulatory infrastructure in the US that would then be compared against the prices of other countries' embedded carbon. And the due diligence that one has to do to know just what the embedded carbon content is of products that are being produced in one's own jurisdiction is massive. To have to do that for all importations for covered products, especially as those covered products expand and the countries involved expand, is an enormously heavy lift. And so, my view is that if this is, in fact, to be the driver of some greater carbon market integration, which, like Michael, I think it can be, and like Junji mentions, is now kind of the growing impetus here, I think some degree of simplification not full standardization by any stretch, but selective harmonization of process, some adjudication at international levels rather than just through bilateral or multilateral trade arrangements or CBAM-like instruments that are geographically specific. I think that has to happen, or else it will be a laudable concept that proves very, very difficult in implementation. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Jackson. So I see Jongwoo raise his hand. Jongwoo, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for very interesting presentation. I fully understand some economic benefits from the carbon market linkages connectivity in the region. For example, the lowering the costs associated with achieving the NDCs without causing any more economic costs, as was mentioned by Michael, and also potential benefits and the positive impact to the international trade, in particular for the region, as was mentioned by Jackson. So uh, I think all the policymakers will be agreeing on potential economic benefits. Then the devils should be in the details how to make it happen, for example. And then in that context, Junji's point on some sequential approach, some still the fragmentation of the even domestic ETS market should be addressed first, and moving on to the next stage. On that point, I have some subtle or differential opinion in a sense. For example, I think that even prompting some discussions about the potential carbon market linkages in the region can be a important impetus for the policymakers in the region to think about how to improve their domestic carbon markets, right? For example, when it comes to the linking the carbon markets for different jurisdictions, they need each individual jurisdiction will vet other counterparts, the MRV system, how much stringent theirs are compared to our own, for example, right? That kind of pure pressures will be a very important jump start to make the domestic carbon market even stronger. Another point is that, for example, in the region, as was mentioned by Jackson, many countries in the region are complementing and or in some sense competing with each other in terms of trade and industrial performance. For example, in the case of China, Japan, and Korea, which are implementing carbon market in some way or another. For example, most of the Asian regional economies are suppressing the carbon price of the ETS market at the moment because they are concerned about losing some industrial competitiveness due to some higher carbon price that firms may have to face. So many countries are concerned about being exposed to so-called first mover disadvantage, right? Then by promoting carbon market linkages and the leveling playing field, as one mentioned by Junjie, we can address that kind of concerns related to the first mover disadvantage to a greater extent. So I think this kind of carbon market linkage discussions and dialogues should be very powerful. The regional cooperation policy tool to promote the stronger regional cooperation, not only on the climate front, but on the economic front at the same time. So the devils should be in the details. Again, we have been conducting some policy consultation, policy dialogue since last year. We met with the METI and the Minister of Environment of Japan, and also we have consultations with the Minister of Trade and Finance and Minister of Environment of the Korea, for example, as was mentioned by Jackson. So they all agree with on the economic benefits from the carbon market linkages, and then their questions lie more on the how to make it happen. What are the downside of carbon market linkages? First and foremost, question from their side is that then what to do with the NDC target at the individual country level. So, for example, the EU ETS and the Switzerland ETS are fully integrated, as we know, right? And does this mean that if China, Korea, and Japan carbon markets integrate with each other, they need to work around the common NDC goals by combining the three countries and this target at the same time? Then how to allocate and this target among different countries. I mean, in utilizing ETS, the integrated ETS market in achieving the NDC goals in a collective manner, and also how to reconcile different carbon market price levels across different jurisdictions. And can we think about some type of the exchange rate, the type of scheme? I mean, the transaction ratio between the carbon allowances of the Chinese market and the Korean market, Japanese market, something like that. Their questions are more on practical aspects of carbon market linkage. Perhaps in the future, we may think more about how to delve deeper into this kind of practical concerns and the steps to be taken by policymakers in the region. That's my feedback to your presentations and the intervention. Thanks.
Thank you, Jongwoo, for that comments and insights. So, I think for at this point to maximize, because probably we'll have a bit of an overtime. So I'll ask Michael Jackson and then Professor Shang to like comment on that, on the practical side of establishing carbon market linkages. How will we make it happen? So probably 1 or 2 minutes from each of our speakers here. So let's start with Michael.
All right. Very, very, again, I think insightful comments, and again, nothing that I could disagree with. I think the question about the NDCs and the need to harmonize or align NDCs, I don't think that is a prerequisite. Precisely that is what Article 6 would then allow us to do, is account for net transfers between jurisdictions that have linked carbon markets, but with different NDCs. And I think that, the nationally determined architecture, or the principle of nationally determined climate action, is something that's with us to stay. I don't think that will disappear. But at the same time, as we have those jurisdictions that are moving faster and are concerned about the competitiveness impacts and about stimulating more action from, their trading partners that they feel are not moving at the same speed, obviously that's going to become a persistent issue in a world of heterogeneous, of asymmetrical, nationally determined action. And so you could imagine, as they turn to trade-related climate measures unilaterally or in clubs, for instance, that and this goes back to where I said so many different trends could potentially converge. You mentioned exchange rates. This is something that is hard to imagine, a jurisdiction saying, well, we have a carbon market and we're willing to have it count only 50% of the mitigation value of your carbon market units, for instance. Hard to imagine, unless, however, you think that maybe there is a convergence of different proposals, one in which we say, okay, we impose a CBAM, but we accept that India does not have to have the same carbon price level as we do in Europe in order to have 100% recognition. We accept a 50% carbon price, but you must then also accept that in a link, we will only count your half so high carbon price, as a sort of with an exchange rate of some sort. So there has to be, I think, a carrot and stick combination in order to navigate these asymmetries and make sure that everybody feels like the package, the outcome is a fair deal. And I could see at least some leeway for that, some latitude for that to happen.
Yes, Jackson. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Kang, for the comment. I'd like Michael agree with all of what you contend there. I would just add that I think on a maybe less specific level and a more broad-based reaction around some degree of harmonization of ambition. Like Michael says, I think that there are instruments, Article 6 being one of them, the sort of exchange rate and differentiated carbon pricing being another, the potential for early steps such as a quoted link approach where you could only have a certain amount of your allowances come from one of the linked markets, so not a truly kind of integrated exchange platform, but rather one that deals with those foreign allowances more like offsets are dealt with in current systems today. All of these are kinds of incremental steps that can be pursued. But your broad point about harmonization of NDC ambitions, while that might not happen in the foreseeable future with these Asian countries that you mentioned, Korea, Japan, and China, because of the different structures of their economic and industrial systems, the main point remains, which is that if countries view a different system as having a fundamentally different level of ambition that can then yield credits of different veracity and a different kind of effort level, and in some instances like that which pertains to China's efficiency-based targets, is really of a different character altogether, then that will be an impediment to linkage. And so having these very early stage conversations that do try to find that necessary denominator across both those technical but also ambition issues is going to be important. It's going to be hard.
Okay, Professor Junji.
Okay, so John Woo's suggestion provide another strategy how to link. I think this should be workable, right? Provide if from the top down provide an impetus for individual countries to coordinate the design of their carbon market. I thought that again, if we have the simple rules mentioned by Jackson, if we have a simple, clear rules, not towarding the full linkage, but with some tolerance of some imperfection, maybe this is doable. So for the multilateral banks to help those countries getting together to negotiate, is like kind of a club, right? Within that club, we have some band for carbon price that we tolerate the linkage. This may be another workable strategy.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think we're at the end of our webinar. So before we conclude, so let's extend a big thank you to our esteemed speakers, Michael, Jackson, and Junji, for their valuable insights and expertise. So your presentations and discussions provided us with a deeper understanding of cross-border carbon linkages. And hopefully we will encourage everyone to continue this conversation and explore further on this topic that we discussed today. So the presentation materials as well as the recording of this webinar will be available on our website for your reference. We will put the link here in the chat box for everyone to see. So once again, thank you all for joining us today. Have a great day ahead and keep safe, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mara, for organizing. Thanks, everybody.
Yes.
Thanks,
You're
Mara. Thanks,
welcome.
everyone. Thanks, everyone, for
Thank
attending.
you.